And welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you in the audience. So as Christian said, my name is Barbara Ryan, Executive Director at WGIC. And so on this session, I really would like to, so Global Methane Observing System, it really ties in nicely, not only with the last panel, but this morning's plenary session. So in fact, there's sometimes when I kind of feel like, you know that saying, everything's been said, but I haven't said it. And so I kind of feel like there's going to be a lot of that in this session today. But first of all, I really do want to thank GHGSAT for organizing the session. I don't know if he's in the room, but Antoine Ramier did a lot of work in the background. So thank you so much for that. And then also, Jean-Francois, you are the only, GHGSAT is the only commercial capability for methane observations in space right now. So you have the dubious honor, I think, of either having a big target on your back or being applauded for that effort, and you probably have both. So
we welcome it.
Thank you for putting this together. I think what we're going to hear from these speakers is that this is an evolving ecosystem. And I would have to say, in kind of getting to know these folks around the table and some work that we, WGIC, did, in many ways, methane may be ahead of the game in terms of international collaboration and some of the other greenhouse gases. We heard yesterday from the French DG for CNES, whether it was cooperation or competition or collaboration. Obviously, as we look around the parties at the table here, I think you're going to see elements of all of that, and that'll come out. And then I think the only other thing I want to say is that, well, let's go ahead and introduce each of the panelists, because you do represent a unique place in that ecosystem. And so just 30 seconds, your name, your organization, and what you're largely responsible for doing. So, and Freddie, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks. Thanks, Barb. So my name is Manfredi Caltagirone. I'm the head of UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory. UNEP is the United Nations Environment Program. And IMEO's reason for existence is to provide accurate, free, and actionable data to those who have the agency that are able to reduce emissions in the time frame that we have, that is 79 months to 2030. Starting with the energy sector, but with the ambition to expand our work to also other sources of methane, such as agriculture, so rice cultivation and livestock, as well as waste.
Thanks. Jean-Francois.
Thanks, Barb. So GHGSAT is a commercial company, and we pioneered the measurement of methane emissions directly from industrial sites from space when we launched our first satellite in 2016. So we now operate about half of all of the satellites, all of the operational satellites that have any sensitivity to methane. Also the only satellites that were specifically designed and for focus on methane specifically. So.
Okay, thanks. Antoine?
Hello, thanks. So Antoine Benoit, Product Manager at Kairos regarding methane emission, working with all the public and private satellites at our disposal to detect and quantify methane emission. So Kairos is the leading environmental company, providing information in both the energy and environmental sectors. We are notably working with the International Methane Observatory, providing them with actionable data on methane emissions.
Thank you, Antoine.
Hi, yeah, I'm Mackenzie Huffman, Director of Strategy and Partnerships at Carbon Mapper. We are a small nonprofit that uses remote sensing from aircraft and satellites to fill data gaps in methane and CO2 emissions. And part of how we do this is we lead a public-private partnership that includes a number of partners, including NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, commercial companies, Planet Labs, among many others, to develop and deploy satellites with the capability to detect, pinpoint, and quantify methane emissions at the scale of individual facilities, while also making all of that data publicly available through the nonprofit. So I work on connecting that to impact.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Steve, last but not least.
Yeah, Steve Hamburg, Chief Scientist of the Environmental Defense Fund, and also the Executive Manager of MethaneSat LLC. EDF is a nonprofit, 55 years old, working across the globe, focused heavily on climate change, as well as very focused on affecting impact. EDF started MethaneSat as a way of trying to complement what we just heard about from the other satellites in providing high precision measurements across not just target mode, but area sources, which will be, and that satellite will be launching in early next year.
Thanks, Steve. You know, I think IAF has done a really nice job putting composition of mixed panels together, but I'm really excited about this one because whether it's UNEP and IMEO or the commercial sector or not-for-profits, two commercial sector companies, it's a great way to build the ecosystem. The only other thing I want to say before we get started, and we're going to split the whole session up into 3 segments. Some background information, why is methane even important, the technological piece of it, and then hopefully a good amount of time at the end to talk about the way forward and challenges and opportunities. But for many of you, you know that I spent most of my career, 40 plus years in the public sector, and then came in to lead this not-for-profit organization. And when we get, you had to be a commercial sector company to join WGIC. What I knew is that through the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, all the major space agencies, public space agencies around the world, had put a phenomenal database together, a MIM database, Missions, Instruments, and Measurements. I come into the not-for-profit or the commercial sector and said, well, where's the analog on the commercial side? Of course, at the time, we know of one now. It's not necessarily open, but we said, where is it? And so we took a baby step on just the 3 major greenhouse gases that are recognized by the convention, methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. Worked with CS, said, here's what the public sector is doing. We compiled the data, and here's what the private sector is doing. And then what emerged was it wasn't just the commercial sector, it was also philanthropies or hybrid missions that were either partnerships, public-private partnerships, or new entities like yours that would come to the table. And yet I don't think many people actually understand the full complexity of this ecosystem and that there are really some unique players in methane observations. And I think there are some wonderful lessons here that could be expanded. And so that's why I'm excited to be here. We took that message to Glasgow, to Sharm el-Sheikh. We'll take it again to Dubai. Governments, parties around the table. Those are governments in these international mechanisms. You've got to continue to invest in your public space agencies or Earth observation agencies. They were here 20 years ago or 50 years ago. We hope they're here 20 or 50 years. But the commercial sector and other parties are coming to the table, increase spatial, spectral, or temporal resolution. And if you parties aren't either putting policies in place for public-private partnerships or mechanisms, like a couple of the last panels have said, for access to other kind of data sources, then you're really sub-optimizing your climate action. So for me, that's all about this. So background, technology, and climate action. I'd just offer anybody to weigh in on any point, but Steve, we're going to turn to you. Methane 101. Why is it important? Where is it? You know, who's doing, you know, where is it on the landscape?
So as we think about methane, as has been mentioned, we have multiple greenhouse gases. But methane is, of course, each one of them is unique. So methane is 120 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Now that's not a number you usually hear, because you usually hear it over a period of time. So that's kilogram for kilogram. And over 20 years, because methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas, it's more than 80 times more powerful than CO2 over the first 20 years after its release. And it's roughly 25 times more over 100 years. But this time dimension really matters. Before I go to that, so methane is responsible currently for roughly 30% of the warming we're currently experiencing. And as we think about how we're going to address the climate problem, we really have to remember we have 2 climate problems. We have the near-term problem, which is driving the rate of warming. How much will it warm over the next few decades? And at what rate will that increase? And what's the long-term total amount of warming? We tend to simplify it as the second problem, but in fact, both really matter for damages. And if we're going to solve the first problem, it's overwhelmingly dominated by methane. So if we want to reduce the rate of warming in the near term, first and foremost, we have to reduce emissions of methane. We also have to do CO2. So this is not an or, it's an and.
Right.
But it's really important to recognize these different roles they play. So where is that methane coming from? The largest sources are from agriculture, but of course it varies from country to country. So this isn't uniform, that's a global average. And fossil fuels is the second, dominated by oil and gas, but of course coal is also important. And then we have waste. So we have those are the dominant sources, but we have to remember that it does vary across space and time. So it's not going to be the same order depending on where we go. What are the distribution of those emissions? What do I mean is, are there just a few large sources? Are there many small sources? And the answer is yes, both. So we have to think about, there's been some recent work, and I'm sure we'll hear about some of the work that Kairos is doing on ultra emitters. So these very large sources, really important, but they're almost literally the tip of the iceberg, maybe 10% of the problem. We also hear about super emitters, which we hear particularly from oil and gas, but other sources. They're also important, but they vary over spatially how important they are. And we're currently working out, because it varies from place to place. In a lot of places, the dominant is smaller emission sources. In some cases, it's the larger super emitters. So what we have to do is be able to create, and we'll talk about that, multiple abilities to measure large point sources, diffuse sources, if we're going to get the whole picture. And really what we have to do is answer three questions. Where are the emissions? How much is being emitted? And how those emissions are changing over time. And to do that, we need to be able to know the total emissions, like to call the denominator problem. Okay. How much is being emitted over how much? So what's that particular place relative to the total? And then we can understand how much is there, how it compares in different geographies, and how are we changing it over time. And to do that, we need to think about how to make those measurements. And we'll hear about those different technologies. We really basically can think about it as two different processes, one of quantifying what's going on and doing that on a global basis. We have not done that for any greenhouse gas empirically up till now, and methane is poised to do that far better than CO2 at this point in time. And then we also need very fine-grained data to be able to take action. We need both kinds of data to affect the changes that we're looking for. With that, I'll turn it back to my colleagues and to get into the meat of how we're going to do that.
All right, thanks. Great summary. First of all, I'll let anybody else that wants to add to anything he said on the methane 101 issue. And I would like to remind the audience that if you've got any questions, use Slido. That should be up and running for this session. Although all of a sudden I've lost the screen. So use Slido. Any other comments on Methane 101 from anywhere around the table? Okay, let's go into the second part then, which is the technological piece. And Mackenzie, I think you're going to kick that off for us.
Yeah, so I'll try to kick it off and then I'll hand it over to Anton. So, what's really exciting about where we are today from a technology perspective is that the stage is full, and it's full of so many diverse actors that are really utilizing what we have from a technological and an initiative perspective to focus on methane measurements and monitoring from space, which was not necessarily the case, 10 years ago. And really where we are today is built on the foundation of work from a lot of the scientific researchers and collaborations with international space agencies to develop the capabilities of the technologies that have been improved upon and deployed to be able to enable quantification and monitoring. And a lot of the last decade had been focused on kind of the development of these sensors with this capability to detect and quantify emissions at the scale of action that we were talking about. And so we're now at this unique point where those technologies are online, or coming online. And that is really exciting, and this panel is a great example of the best examples of those who are actively working to now use those technologies to drive climate action. But what we really know, and what Dr. Hamburg was really getting at, is that there's no one technology that can tackle every part of the methane challenge. There's no silver bullet, and so we need to remember that when we think about kind of the ecosystem of what we're looking at. And a lot of these different technologies are optimized to address different parts of this problem, like Dr. Hamburg mentioned. There's diffuse area sources and then large point sources. And these different capabilities of the technology that Antoine's going to talk about, can really help to support a lot of different uses. So some types of monitoring are really geared to support aggregate accounting and inventory and policy development around emissions. So thinking about regional and national scales. And others are really optimized to support direct mitigation, guidance at local and facility scale. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be people on the ground. There's waste managers, operators, municipalities, farmers, who actually need to implement the solutions, and they need the data to do that. And then there's some that can do little bits of both, so that's really exciting. But to address both of these types of monitoring, you really do need this portfolio of technologies and approaches. And that's not just satellites, so we got to give a shout out to the ground-based and airborne systems that are also a part of helping us to understand where the emissions are coming from and how to tackle them. And so I just wanted to note that. But even though we have this kind of emerging ecosystem of technologies and actors, there's still a number of gaps that remain. And in particular, there's trust in the data. So it's not completely trusted yet. There's a lot of validation, verification efforts that are underway. Capacity to understand the data. So I know we'll get into this, but really helping to build the technical capacity of those that are going to use it and need it to drive action. And then resources to kind of scale the systems that we are building today to be able to offer the frequency of monitoring and measurement that we need to make sure that not only we're catching the emissions and tackling them, but keeping them mitigated, because that's also its own journey. And so this is really a big part of why we led a public-private partnership to bring some of this technology innovation and really work to scale it. Because one of the biggest issues is really making sure that this data is accessible, actionable, and understandable. But this is just kind of a piece. So I'll turn it over to Antoine to talk a little bit about the landscape of missions focused on methane monitoring.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I just want to set up a little bit the context about observing methane from space. So it really started 15 years ago with the GOSAT mission from JAXA. And for the first time, researchers were able to quantify the total methane emission globally. And this was a major breakthrough because we were able to compare bottom-up inventory using notably methane intensity to real measurement coming from satellite. Then, 5 years ago, the mission from the European Space Agency, Sentinel-5P, came in, and it gave us the ability not to look only at total emission globally, but at total methane emission at the regional level. And so researchers were able to estimate total methane emission in a region, for instance, in the Permian Basin, and we observed, for instance, that there were huge discrepancies between what was reported by companies and what we observed with satellite. Sentinel-5P was also able to detect ultra-emitters. So this was, what is ultra-emitters? Ultra-emitters is a source that emit more than 10 tons per hour. And we estimate that ultra-emitters represent around 10% of the methane emission of the oil and gas sector. So this is really, really important. And just to give you an example, at Kairos, we are monitoring more than 1,000 ultra-emitter events per year. And in terms of CO2 equivalent, it represents the emission of 20 million cars yearly, just on 1,000 of events. So this links to what Stephen was saying about the different type of sources. So this, what we call area flux mappers, so for instance, GOSAT and Sentinel-5P are very interesting to understand what are the global and regional emissions. Yet, with their core spatial resolution, we are not able to provide facility-level attribution and to attribute methane emission to specific facility. So in parallel to this area flux mapper, space agency and commercial company develop what is called point source imagers. And the big difference between point source imager and area flux mapper is that point source imager can attribute methane emission to a specific facility with a lower detection threshold. So it started in 2015 with the Hyperion mission, Then it was quickly followed by GHGSat in 2016. And now there are plenty of missions that are coexisting. So both on the multispectral side, so we have, for instance, just to quote a few, we have Landsat 8 and 9 from NASA. We have Sentinel-2 from the European Space Agency. We have also commercial missions like Worldview 3. We have also hyperspectral sensor, to name a few, Prisma from Italian Space Agency, and MAP from DLR. Emit. And so you have to understand that all these technologies are complementary, and that today we have the technology is already here to act and to mitigate methane emissions. So for instance, at Kairos, we are providing Sentinel-5P detection and Sentinel-2 detection to IMEO so that they can notify government and operators so that they can act on methane emission. Yet, in the coming 2 years, a lot of new missions will come out, so both on the area flux mapper. So we will have the new Sentinel-5 mission, the new GOSAT mission, we will have CO2M, and on point source imagers. So a lot of the new actors are represented here. So GHGSat will be expanding its constellation, Carbon Mapper will be launching its constellation, MethaneSat will be launching its satellite, both doing point source imaging and area flux mapping. And this technology will help to accelerate to mitigate methane emission, and this will be complementary to what is existing. So just, I guess, a final word, we have to understand that the more satellite, the more operating satellite there are, the more we can mitigate methane emission.
Okay, great, thanks. Antoine, yeah, Steve, go right ahead.
Well, I just want to add one thing to your great summary, is to remember that many of the satellites, so the Sentinel-5P Triphomi is giving you concentration data, just like GOSAT is. And that's not directly translatable into flux. So one of the challenges we have with a lot of the data currently is that it's not policy relevant. And it requires very sophisticated handling, which currently is not automated, and which means we're not able to use most of the data effectively. That's the key change we need to see. We're starting to see that, but that will be the critical change so that the data will be out in flux data product. How much is being emitted? Where is it being emitted?
Yeah.
Any other comments on the technology side? Maybe just a couple tweaks. You mentioned Landsat, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my old USGS hat, joint NASA USGS program, not just NASA,
Exactly.
although they had lion's share in building and launching the satellite. And then, Steve, the only thing I think, and it may come up into the discussion, is that even when they are just concentrations versus flux, there probably are going to be people that say, well, we just can't make a blanket statement that it's not policy relevant. Because again, it might be in certain contexts that some of that information
I want to push back a little bit on that.
Let's do that at the discussion,
fine.
because I do think that will come up in maybe a challenges piece too. And I think both Antoine and Kenzie kind of set the stage with the complexity of the partners and the ecosystem that we live in, differences of opinion on that. So, Manfredi, let's go to you first on challenges, opportunities, I don't know, policy challenges, regulatory, technical, capacity building, anything you want to comment.
And all of the above.
Just for the audience, we're not all of the above. And so we're now switching into the third and final section of this talk, which is the way forward.
Yeah.
And I hope.
So Antoine made an example of way in which we're using satellite data to drive change on the ground. And then everyone knows here, satellite observation per se doesn't reduce emissions. We need to give this data in the hand, as Kenzie also mentioned, of those who really have the ability to make change. And in the oil and gas sector, it's simpler currently than in other sectors. And so for the oil and gas sector, we provide information to the asset managers, the operators on the ground, and as well as the government in which jurisdictions these assets are located. This is part of a program that UNEP launched at COP27 together with the IEA and the Climate and Cleaner Coalition, and in support of the objectives of the Global Methane Pledge that, as you might know, is an international effort subscribed now by 150 countries, in which those countries commit to collectively reduce emissions at least 30% between now and 2030. That is the floor of what we need to do according to the IPCC to keep the 1.5 temperature increase alive, as is said. And so through the Methane Alert and Response System, we use a variety of satellites just to confirm the fact that no single satellite can give us all the answers. But through this combination of satellites, we then provide information again to the operators, and we're starting to see some actions. In some cases, the operators are aware of the emissions that they're having, but those might require some more capital-intensive intervention that needs more planning. But in some other cases, they have not realized that a tank the tank top has been left open, or a flare is unlit, or a valve is not tight as it should. And we're seeing example of mitigation as a result of the notification that we're providing. This is just a start. It only covers the tip of the iceberg, as Steve was mentioning, but is an initial step that is necessary also to build the confidence to the larger community of the opportunities that this satellite observation represent, if combined with, as Kenzie was mentioning, to other less top-down system. Now, the objective obviously is to reduce emission, in particular from the oil and gas sector, dramatically between now and 2030. We know enough to act. We know that companies and governments should take action. But what we believe is that, as UNEP, is that this global data set of empirically verified methane emissions will be really able to provide different actors with the information they need to better target their action. So if they are consuming countries, to prioritize import from countries that have lower emissions associated with the production and transportation of fuels. In case of producing countries, to better target regulation or actions but also for the civil society and the general public to hold the system accountable. And so we believe that there is an important element that is related to transparency. There is now talks about radical transparency on climate action, and this is absolutely where we need to get, to give the information to those who can act on it, but to provide the information also to the general public so that we can reward concrete actions, and we can the alternative to reward that is not punish, but lack of actions, right? I was trying to look for a more diplomatic word that I didn't find, but hopefully you won't hold me accountable for that. Right. I'll leave it here to start.
All right, Manfredi, thanks. You know what? We'll drill down into that a little bit more, because whether it's back to the in situ point measurements that Kenzie talked about, or maybe even some of the database, I understand the U.S. has got or will have a greenhouse gas information system, just U.S. agencies, as I understand it, NASA, NOAA, and EPA, emerging effort. Maybe there are other examples around the world as well.
And if I can say, that is great, right? So we absolutely need the most advanced countries and economies to take a leadership role on this topic. But we also need to make sure that everyone else in the world has access to this information, and as you were saying, knows how to use this information. So we're working with a number of actors, those around this stage, but also academic institutions, not only to engage them on the monitoring, but also on the capacity building, on being able to make products that folks on the ground are able to use with confidence. And frankly speaking, there is a risk of all this flux of information that will come down from space, but from other methodologies and from other approaches. And there is the risk of this confusing more than is going to help. So what we really need is to make sure that everyone has the confidence that the information that are provided are accurate, and as I was saying, they're free and that are actionable in the time frame we have to reduce the climate crisis.
Jean-François, thanks. Jean-François, I think that's a good segue over to you on a couple different points. One, the accuracy issue. I understand you've now gotten third-party status as an ESA mission. I understand the protocols and rigor associated with that are pretty intense. But also maybe on the action side, when I hear you talk, I hear a lot of passion, and I guess I automatically think of Geneva and Voltaire, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. So you want to talk a little bit about action on that particular?
Yeah, well, our approach is obviously a little bit different, right? Like, we're a commercial company. So in order for us to survive and continue launching more satellites, so we can do some of the things that were talked about today, like monitoring emissions more persistently, so we can figure out, are they intermittent? Are they always on? Which ones should be prioritized to be fixed? So in order to be able to do that, we have to launch more satellites. To launch more satellites, we have to generate revenue. So, you know, we talked about the policy making, and that's very important. Policy making eventually drives change. Advocacy usually drives change as well on the longer term. We take a slightly different approach where we work with industry to get them to address the emissions. I mean, in a lot of cases, you know, you look at the oil and gas industry, for example, these leaks will be addressed by the operators. By and large, they have to put boots on the ground, walk to the site, and go fix what has been identified. So I would perhaps push back a little bit on what Steve mentioned earlier, that measuring concentrations was not appropriate. It might not be appropriate for advocacy and policy making, but measuring concentration and converting it to an actual flux has proven to be actually quite accurate through blind testing. But more importantly, it's proven to be very effective in working with companies and showing them where to take action and how to prioritize, because you can give them a scale as to which emission should be addressed, and also identify exactly where, which actual piece of equipment would benefit from that. So, that's what we focus on. We focus on engaging industry, providing them with that data. We have the largest database of point source emissions by far. Not all of them are readily addressable. Some landfills and some dump sites around the world are very difficult to address. Coal mining, especially open pit coal mining, remains a very nebulous thing to address. Underground mining is much easier because you can actually capture the methane. Technology exists. To do that, it's not necessarily easy, it's costly, but the mechanisms exist. So we have many examples of working directly with industry to do that, and we've actually even published examples of that. One of them was a white paper we published a few months ago with our partners at OGCI and also Carbon Limits that are based here in Oslo, where we did something that had been thought to be maybe not impossible, but something that was thought to be very difficult, is to engage local oil companies in countries like Iraq. Like, this particular project was in Iraq, and it was on a small scale, but we managed through an outreach and showing them some opportunities for them to achieve reductions, that it was actually possible to first engage them successfully in a productive manner, get the leaks fixed, but more importantly, start that discussion that Manfredi was talking about in terms of educating, creating a culture that not just fixes the leaks, but also works to prevent them from happening in the first place. So proper maintenance of equipment, those kinds of things. So that's what that project was about. That's the bit that Carbon Limits was doing. And we're now scaling that to many other countries. And again, it's a small scale, it's a starting point, but it plays a role into this whole ecosystem of reducing emissions that we're talking about. So, you know, when we look at, Manfredi mentioned the global methane pledge. Okay, we're looking at 2 years ago now at Glasgow in COP26, and that's by 2030. And now we're, 7 years away from 2030, and we have little to show for. So this is coming up really fast, and the point is that's a 30% reduction by 2030. We don't have to address everything. We're working on things like rice paddies, like dump sites that are difficult to address, melting permafrost, all these different things that are difficult to address but need to be looked at. But to get to that first 30%, We can work with industry, we can work with operators around the world to actually achieve that, and at the same time, all pull in the same direction to do that. So that's perhaps a different look on things, but that's our approach.
I want to give everybody an opportunity to talk about kind of this last piece about way forward and challenges and opportunities, but there are two questions that from the audience that I think kind of pertain to what you're saying. One, how do you plan on building trust within the industry, as some may question or even challenge data from observations, even supported by NGOs, not just the commercial sector, but essentially non-government is what I'm hearing here. I mean, they trust the public sector agencies, maybe not so much on the philanthropic or NGOs or commercial sector. And then also, what about work with the national security sector? So if you could touch on those 2 points, and then we'll open it up.
I could touch on them very briefly so that others can have a chance to also chime in. But in terms of building trust, first of all, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. There are geopolitical considerations that are really important to take into account. But I would contend that the lack of trust isn't just, like the problem that we're facing today is that it's not a lack of trust in commercial versus NGO or public sector. It's a lack of trust in satellites. And that's alarming, frankly, because the data is proven, not just our mission, like all missions that have been flying that Antoine mentioned for years, that data support speaks for itself, and you can cross-correlate between platforms, and that's something that we do. We collaborate together with IMEO, for example, to kind of combine the different data sets, show to certain countries that this is that can be trusted. So there's a need for advocacy. There's a need for also for this kind of data to be shown to these operators. But there's also the reality that sometimes when we advocate in the media, for example, some of these actors that we're counting on to make a difference are getting their backs up, and they're taking a step back and saying, okay, this is not something I want to work with. And that's not necessarily always productive. So there's a balance. Like we're all walking a certain high wire act where, in Europe, in North America, revealing some things about companies can be really, can push them to take action. In other countries, it's not effective at all. They might just start dismissing it completely, and will take longer for them to actually use the data that can be acted on today. So that would be the point that I would make for that.
All right, thanks. National security sector, real quick?
Or? The national security sector is kind of related to all of this. I mean, there's an interest in understanding the global footprint of emissions, and I think you see the same sort of questions and concerns, and the data that satellites provide is equally useful to them. So.
Okay. Steve, I think you had your hand up, and then Kenzie.
Well, I just want to clarify something. I think we're in radical agreement here. So my comment about the concentrations isn't that you don't need them, they're not sufficient.
Yeah.
So that's where Kairos and what Antoine's work has really been so powerful is developing the software to take the Tropomi data and convert it into policy relevant flux data. So it's not that you don't need concentrations, it's just most of the missions stop at concentrations, and you have to take those extra steps. So that's the key there. So I think we're all saying the same thing, but it's important to remember that when a mission puts it out as concentrations, that itself is not actionable. It's useful for science, but it's not actionable. You have to take the next step.
Yeah.
And I just want to add one other thing to Mackenzie's point. There are many tools out there to look at methane, which is wonderful. We've got, as you said, aircraft and drones and car-based. But the bottom line is, for the overwhelming majority of the globe, we only have space-based data. So we don't have access. So the point is that we're blind in much of the world. And what we need to do to have, as Manfredi said, radical transparency, we really need to have global data of equal quality that's demonstrated. And then the last point I'd make is that there is a growing effort to do coordinated reference, controlled release experiments, testing, which everybody can see. It's totally transparent. And I'm fairly optimistic that we're seeing a lot of agreement and alignment because of these kinds of efforts, that there is a growing confidence in the space base because there's truly independent testing, validation. You don't have to trust anyone, you can look at the independent data.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to belabor the point but I will. And that's the only red flag, or the hairs on the back of my neck, went up when we said that it might not be policy relevant, because some out in the science community will argue that the science they're doing, maybe there's a long lead time, but it will in fact be policy relevant at some point.
Eventually.
So, yes.
But there's an important distinction between that, because we need action now. And I'm a scientist and I use a lot of data, but you can't, one of the things most people don't understand is you take that concentration map, and just because there's more here and less there does not translate to where the sources are.
Yeah, no, okay, Kenzie, let's go to you.
Or do you want to respond?
No,
Antoine?
please go on. I will go next.
No, I was just going to second a lot of that. You know, in terms of needing this, we're blind in a lot of places, and that is what's so amazing about satellites and the capabilities that they're bringing to this equation. And that is where scaling these technologies and getting more, I always say more eyes in the sky, we need it. And so getting it at that granularity and building towards kind of this global monitoring system that brings together a lot of this transparency and helps support accountability, but also engagement with those who would prefer a little more of a private touch. And I think that is really critical, and why partnerships and why nonprofits and why commercial sector is all really integral to solving this problem together. The other thing is, you know, on the lack of trust in the industry, but also with satellites, I think that was spot on. And it is a lot of kind of how can we help to better support, you know, the frameworks and the validation efforts, just trust that those are built. And this actually came up in the science comms section yesterday, which is even though the science and the data is clear, talking about it, making it clear, building that trust outside of the science community is also really, really critical. And I think that's where governments can really step in. They can do a lot to help to help reinforce that these measurements are accurate and they have a lot of science behind them, and also support frameworks or places that actually can enable the type of testing that we need to just show that and prove that. And so there's a lot of stuff underway in the US. For example, there's METEC, which is in Colorado, that actually does that for ground-based and airborne sources, and they're looking at satellites. So there's a lot of those types of things that governments can really do to help enable the trust in the data and the science in a way that reinforces that we already know that it is actually, you know, solid.
Yeah. Thanks, Kenzie. Antoine.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to add on what Steve was saying. So yeah, independent experiments are already here. Some has been conducted, and the results are here to prove that we can use satellite data. Other will be done with upcoming satellite data. And so we can't attack satellite by saying it's not precise, because we have this independent experiment proving that, yes, it's precise. On the drive climate action, what you were saying, Jean-François and Manfredi, I wanted to add that first, we need also to increase public awareness, because methane is not a subject that everyone can address. And for that, we need, in my opinion, we need to work with journalists so that the subject is taken serious. So for instance, at Kairos, we are working with Bloomberg News. We are trying to provide data to other journalists to be sure that the methane problem is understood by the whole space community, but also by the general public. So this is the first part. Second part is that also we need regulation, because, GHGSat is saying they are working with operators, but to be sure that operators are tackling this problem, there need to be regulation. So in the US, there is the Inflation Reduction Act that should lead to a real plan for methane emission next year. In the European Union, there is this new law that was voted by the European Parliament 2 weeks ago, that needs to be voted by the Council, so that we have a law that regulates imported methane. And with all this legal framework, operator will be constrained to work on this and to tackle this problem.
Okay, Manfredi.
Thank you, Barb. Two points. One on the control release, then the testing. IMEO is trying to help on this front. We're expanding the work that some academics have done in the US. There has been recently an agreement between METEC and a European equivalent of METEC that was announced. We're hoping to be able to expand these also to other jurisdictions. For example, in Asia, we're planning as IMEO a big control release engagement for beginning of 2024. which will be inviting technology providers from, as you said, not only from satellites, but also drone and aerial and potentially ground-based monitoring system to try to test and understand in which condition they work best and how they can be combined together to achieve results. That is what we want, that is the reduction. And then on the trust issue, I think we need to, so UNEP, let me back up a second. UNEP runs an initiative that is called Oil and Gas Mineral Partnership 2.0 that currently covers around 40% of global oil and gas production, has 120 oil and gas companies. And you can imagine an oil and gas company is not the usual fellow of the United Nations Environment Program. And indeed, there was a little bit of convincing to be done to get the leadership of on both sides, on the company side, but also on the UN side, to say, well, this is too big of a prize to not work together. And what we're getting through this partnership is asset level data that are empirically measured by the companies and then reported at asset level to UNEP in a way in which we can corroborate the emissions with other sources of data, be them from planes, realizing that there are constraints in certain jurisdictions to fly a plane, and indeed increasingly from satellite. And this is, I think, a key element is the need to get our neck out there and take risks. The objective here is, again, to reduce emissions, and if to do that we need to, again, engage with unlikely fellows, so be it, right? And so this is an example. There are clearly others, but I think it's something that is pretty powerful in also in building trust, in showing industrial partners that we are ready to give them credibility in exchange for action, and so more of these examples, I think, should be brought up.
So I wanted to add to Antoine's point about regulations driving action, and it's entirely true. So regulations do that. Regulations are crucial, and in some places, regulations have shown to be really effective. So from Canada has demonstrated that over time the regulations can make a difference. And there's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of progress to be made, but at the same time, the situation is shown improvements. So, however, there's other drivers that can compel, that can drive emissions reductions. And the challenge with regulations is that they take a long time to come to fruition. And sometimes they take even longer to see the full effect. So you still obviously need to work on them and get them put in place. But you use the EPA regulation that's being discussed in the U.S. for over almost a year and a half now. That will be released soon. It'll be released just in time for a new election cycle. It will be held up in courts. It might be scrapped or canceled, and then the cycle will repeat itself. And so, there's going to be a need for reinforcement and pushing for these to be put in place. In the meantime, there's other factors that I was just alluding to that can compel people to change their behaviors. One of them is the pressure from investors. The investment community, shareholders are putting pressure on industry to reduce their emissions and show the progress. So even in the absence of regulations, there's already evidence that some operators, some companies don't really have a choice. They have to do that. They have to. The other factor that compels it is, frankly, for the oil and gas industry specifically, if they're leaking methane, they're leaking product. So the realization that you keep that molecule in the pipe and you can actually sell it, or so you're saving the environment at the same time. So I guess the end goal that we're all seeking is happening, but the actual initial driver might be a little bit different. But in the end, should we really care? I would argue that probably not. I mean, right now we're after that first 30% for the global methane pledge, but over time, regulations will drive everything. Absolutely.
I was also, let's go ahead. Let me hear from you guys.
So I just want to completely agree with it, and I think coming back to the point that Mackenzie made, it's an all of the above. So we're not talking about there's one magic bullet here. We need to have multiple mechanisms. And I would just say one thing in the US we just need to remember is, yes, there are regulations, I mean, maybe a little more optimistic, but there's also law. So it's not just regulations. So there's a methane fee that was put in law by the Congress last year. So that's important to remember. But we do need to remember it's all of the above, and that we can also need to remember that it's not just oil and gas. Oil and gas is a low-hanging fruit. But we are also seeing commitments like Danone, who's saying on the ag side, we're seeing countries working in, we were partnering with New Zealand on the ag side. So we have to remember that there are multiple sectors. Oil and gas is very important, but not sufficient. And IMEO, I'll put the plug in for IMEO, is going to be working across all the sectors and appropriately. The other thing that's really important is the controlled releases are not just, so we're doing currently single blind, they're going to be doing double blind. Happy to explain to anyone the difference, but this is important. As we get more sophisticated and better, people are going to have even more confidence, because we're going to get better and better independent validations, and the system that Manfredi mentioned at very multiple geographies. This is all of the kind of coming together, and we need to really recognize, and that within the next year, we're going to see a radical change in the quantity of data that will be available. We'll have a comprehensive map of North American oil and gas methane emissions by the end of the year. We're going to see it in the end of next year across the globe.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm sorry, did you guys raise your hand?
I think Manfredi raised it.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I mean, just to build on what Steve was mentioning and Jean-François was mentioning, we're talking about difficulties on using regulatory regimes in two of the countries that probably have the highest institutional capacity in the world, and we need to make sure that we take a global approach here. More than 50% of oil and gas production, looking at oil and gas, but it's the same is for agriculture and for waste, is coming from the south of the world. And so how do we put in place systems that allow them to work effectively to reduce emission? And how do we create the right incentive and the right support for them to take on this challenge? Because it won't be enough to fix the problem in Canada and in Europe. We need to really take a global approach.
Thanks for that. You guys, for a couple of the questions that I didn't get to on here, please reach out to the individual speakers, because some are ag-related, some are still really back to the communications piece and the kind of the boring part about talking about standardization. I think a great question to end on for everyone, and again, just 30 seconds each. What are the realistic outcomes of your work in 20 years? Realistic outcomes of your work in 20 years. So what will it look like, Steve?
We're going to slow the rate of warming dramatically as a function of methane emissions reductions. We've seen, despite the slow progress we described, we've seen a radical change in the awareness and the focus. There's not pushback on the importance of methane anymore. Now we got to get it done. In the next couple of years, we're going to see space-based capacity growing exponentially, and we're going to see, I think, quite dramatic reductions. I am an optimist because I've seen so much change in the last decade, but we have a lot of hard work to do, and that will change the rate of warming in my lifetime.
Thanks, Steve. Kenzie?
Yeah, no, everything Steve said, that is exactly right. I think we're going to achieve some reductions. I think the other big thing is we're going to have an entire group and generation of scientists and people on the ground who understand satellites and the use and capabilities and how all of this data integrates that are so much more capable than what we have today, because we're at the forefront of connecting those dots. And I also think we're going to be, expanding into really interesting new types of technologies that can give us more precision and much more visibility and have, as I said, more eyes in the sky that's actually going to get us the data on a real-time basis globally at the coverage and the frequency that we need to maintain all of this wonderful work that everybody's doing.
Thanks, Kenzie. Antoine?
Thanks. Yeah, so two things just to comment on what Steve said. So methane lifetime is around 12 years. So in 20 years, if we start now to decrease, we will see real impact on global warming very soon. So this is the first thing. Second thing is about the way we will have more people working on this sector, because regulation will introduce methane fees like in the US. This will bring a lot of money to the sector, and we will have more and more people and more technology up there to work on this. So I'm pretty optimistic on this side. as Steve, but I think it will make a major impact.
Yeah, good. Somebody in the audience will be quite happy with that response because there was a question about funding, and is it always going to be on the public sector side?
I'm happy to
Thanks
take
for
the
that,
question
yeah.
after the session.
All right. Jean-François.
Well, I think we'd have issues if we didn't all violently agree with what Steve said. So yeah, everything that Steve said, achieving reductions, but I'll deviate from your rule to say a realistic outcome in 20 years. And if I have to dream a little bit, in 20 years, if we can be out of business because there's fewer point sources to measure, and people operators and companies around the world are actually using responsible practices to not just mitigate but prevent before it happens, then it will be, that would be the dream scenario. Of course, there's still a need to monitor. There's still a need to keep an eye. You don't take the battery out of your smoke detector because there hasn't been a fire in your house for 6 months. So you still need to take a look. But we've talked about the full body of work of eyes in the sky, and that will continue, of course. So we'll make sure that the progress continues.
And Freddie.
So reductions in 20 years, and as building on some the others have said, getting a better understanding of why emissions are coming from in the first place. So there is this assumption that emissions are somehow stochastics. They happen because they happen, and we should prove this hypothesis and check whether it's true. And my intuition is that we think this way because we don't know enough, because we have not paid enough attention to the methane problem until very recently. And all these efforts will be helping in getting a better understanding of why emissions come from in the first place, so that we can take, as Jean-François was saying, actions before the emissions get emitted in the first place. Thank you.
You guys, there are just 2 points that I said I wanted to come back to, and then we'll wrap this up. And it really was the in situ, or Kenzie, that you said, because that report that we put together on a mapping of methane emissions, public, private, and hybrid, that was done in partnership with Al Gore's group, Climate Trace, and GEO, the group on Earth observations. And GEO is fond of saying about Earth observations, it's not just space-based observations, it's any observations in, on, or around the Earth. And then I'm also reminded of the Nairobi Conference of the Party. So somebody mentioned it was at COP15. So how many years ago, right? Yeah. CIAS put a report together and said, while in situ measurements will remain essential because they measure what we can't measure from space, that Earth observation satellites are the only realistic means to collect the global data that we need to tackle climate change. So that was COP15. We're already on COP28. We've got to somehow continue to keep some pressure and urgency on this issue. Thank you, everybody, for the urgency that you're bringing and the collaboration and cooperation. And thanks to the audience for hanging in with us for a couple minutes too late. Thank you.